welcome to episode 1 of the Dreamcast Files, a journey through all 248 original American releases for the Sega Dreamcast. Now, my name's Brian, and if you recognize me at all, you might be saying, wait a second, I thought we were streaming. The streaming situation proved to be a little more logistically challenging than I anticipated. Also, I found myself more interested in the research of, what if I just made the whole plane out of the research? And we just did this together on our own time. And so what I'm doing instead is we're going to go through each game, but we're going to take our time. And we're going to learn. We're going to start fresh. So we're heading back to 9/9/99 for the release of the Sega Dreamcast. And we're going to start at the top of the mountain. Soulcalibur.
Soulcalibur was a sequel to Soul Edge, a weapons-based 3D fighter released in arcades in 1995, on the PlayStation as Soul Blade about a year later. Set in the year 1583, Soul Edge tells the story of 9 disparate warriors searching for the titular ultimate sword, stolen by a pirate named Cervantes de Leon. Soul Edge was well enough regarded, although it was overshadowed by the acclaim and anticipation of games from similar but more prominent fighting series like Tekken and Virtua Fighter. The Soul Edge team went back to the drawing board for a sequel, with their biggest development being the innovation of the 8-way run, which allowed for free-range movement on the playing field, instead of simply scooting on a set axis like most 3D games of the time. They called the game Soulcalibur, intending it to be a portmanteau of Soul and Excalibur. So, I guess if you're pronouncing it correctly, it's like Soulcalibur. But that's dumb. I'm not going to do that. The main thing differentiating the series from its brethren, like the aforementioned Tekken or Virtua Fighter, was, as producer Hiroaki Toriyama summed it up, fun and diversity in weapons combat. The game was released in arcades in the summer of 1998 and was an immediate hit. And because of the similarities in the motherboards, the dev team on the Dreamcast port actually improved the graphical output of the arcade original, adding full 3-dimensional backgrounds and a slew of new game modes. Soulcalibur was an instant smash on the fancy new console, garnering gargantuan plaudits, the likes of which were rarely seen before or since. In fact, even now, Soulcalibur remains in the top 5 highest-rated games of all time on Metacritic. The game retains nearly all of the characters from Soul Blade, and adds a bunch of new ones too, including eventual fan favorites like the wandering pirate Maxie and De Leon's illegitimate pirate daughter, Ivy. It's a game set in the 16th century, it's a lot of pirates. Each fighter has their own weapon and fighting style, which diversifies the fighters even more than their base characterization, although that is certainly distinctive as well. The visuals are eye-popping, and the characters are interesting, but the reason Soulcalibur stands at the apex of the fighting game mountain is that its gameplay is an incredible combination of approachable and deeply complex. Even a near quarter-century later, the gameplay is remarkably fluid, and each fighter has their own unique skills. Because of this, it's a very easy game to pick up and play. If you want to button mash, you can do it, and still win some fights and have some fun. But the combat is complex, and there's a large series of challenging input strings that you can chain together for true mastery. The Sega Dreamcast had a short but meaningful reign at the top, and Soulcalibur led the charge, dropping day one and basically having every person that played it immediately fall in love. As we go on this journey, chronicling all 248 original games released for the Sega Dreamcast, I ranked them based on original release scoring, and I hate to break it to you, but we've already seen number 1. Soulcalibur is as perfect as fighting games get, and as such, is regarded as being nearly as perfect as any games get. Full stop. We will see other great games on this list, including many other great fighting games, but none quite so beloved as Soulcalibur. Up next, Sega gets into a spat with Electronic Arts and accidentally invents the most beloved football series of all time. During the production stage for the Sega Dreamcast's release, there was a series of small hang-ups in each release district. Japan's launch was delayed due to a shortage of manufactured chipsets. Australia had a setback when customs officials detained the entire console shipment after deciding its country of origin was not sufficiently labeled. In America, the big deal was a weirdly heated spat with major video game publisher Electronic Arts. Their head of creative, a man named Bing Gordon, accused Sega of flip-flopping, saying EA's developers didn't want to work on Sega's new hardware, and said Sega, quote, wasn't acting like a competent company, end quote. He also made sure to add that Sega couldn't afford EA's license, which I'm sure had nothing to do with Sega turning down EA's offer to be the exclusive sports game developer for the system, since Sega had just spent $10 million purchasing the company Visual Concepts to develop their own in-house sports games. So the preeminent football brand, EA's Madden NFL series, would not appear in any way on the Sega Dreamcast. In the last few decades of Madden exclusivity, that series has become sort of the Marvel Studios of sports games, rarely making games that go above and beyond, but at least deliver a consistently serviceable product. In the late 90s, the football landscape below Madden was all over the place. You could stop at the rental store for a football sim and come up with something pretty good. Or something not so good. It was a complete crapshoot. The Dreamcast counted 2 football games among its 19 launch titles. One, the ludicrous, over-the-top NFL Blitz 2000, and one more sober and realistic, Visual Concepts' flagship debut as Sega Sports, NFL 2K. Now, you may think 20-plus straight seasons with new Madden games each and every year may have dulled the impact of the footage you're seeing from being eye-poppingly impressive, but oddly enough, a common theme among the reviews at the time was that NFL 2K didn't do any one thing distinctly revolutionary. It just did absolutely everything exceedingly well, bringing together a package that had never been so consistently good before, while also looking great. Madden was the king because they had good controls, but their character models, while acceptable, were fairly boxy and jagged. The Quarterback Club series had honestly pretty nice visuals, especially on the player models, but those games played like dog shit and suckered me in multiple times in middle school for a weekend rental. NFL 2K was visually refined, with character models more complex and detailed than Madden's players, but also offered excellent, responsive gameplay, as well as an aesthetic presentation that felt more like watching televised football than any previous game had been. Football games, like the sport itself, live and die with the accuracy of its individual pieces. And in every way, NFL 2K shines. The collision detection is quite good, the passing is responsive, the animation is fluid. Historically, defense in football games has never been my favorite thing, but the timing here feels responsive, so tapping the button at the right time will actually allow you to disrupt the pass or get interceptions. As far as modes, there's nothing too out of the ordinary here. The wildest innovation here is actually in play calling. The Dreamcast had a memory card that could function as its own freestanding little Tamagotchi machine, with a screen and buttons and everything. And although few games really came up with a lot of meaningful things to do with it, NFL 2K attempted to use it to assuage that age-old sports game quandary. Your bum-ass friend sneaking a peek at whatever play you called. Instead, on multiplayer games of NFL 2K, the play calling was available entirely through the little VMU card screen on the controller, so you could pick plays in peace, and your looky-loo pals were none the wiser. In practice, it's pretty limited and hard to read, but it's a fun attempt at innovation and showed the spirit of boundary pushing that would carry over to the franchise's subsequent games. We will see 2 more NFL 2K games during the Dreamcast's lifespan. But after that, only 3 more installments total came out before Madden got the monopoly. And there's been 0 official NFL games outside the Madden umbrella since 2004's ESPN NFL 2K5. Those Maddens do a lot of things well, but in the last few decades, they've really plateaued into mostly just annual roster updates with minor graphical tweaks. And it's hard not to feel robbed of the rising tide floating all boats that the NFL 2K series could have been. Pushing Madden to be better, and making innovations and crazy ideas on their own as the series went. NFL 2K was a huge step forward for video game football, and that it still holds up so well today is a big compliment to the Visual Concepts team, who were better for Madden's absence. Up next, y'all wanna go fast? In the first half of the 1990s, there were 2 major video game home consoles: Nintendo's Super Nintendo and Sega's Genesis. Nintendo's flagship mascot was the leaping, platforming plumber, Mario, who had a run of some of the greatest games ever made in the mid to late 80s. 1991's Super Mario World, the first on 16-bit hardware, was equally acclaimed, and Nintendo showed patience developing a follow-up, keeping Mario in the public eye with subtle offshoots like the influential racing game Super Mario Kart, and interesting experiments like the computer mouse peripheral-based Mario Paint. Into this 16-bit era stepped Mario's first meaningful contender to the throne, a sassy, youthful blue hedgehog named Sonic, who runs at supersonic speeds and is trying to collect rings to defeat the evil scientist Dr. Robotnik. The first game was a sensation, and 18 months later, Sega cashed in with an equally acclaimed sequel. Then they cashed in with a new game for the Sega CD add-on, then a pinball game, then a Puyo puzzle game, then a third full Sonic game, then a spin-off featuring Sonic and side character Knuckles, then a spin-off of that for the 32X add-on starring only Knuckles, as well as a half-dozen handheld games, to say nothing of the 2 simultaneously running animated series based on the character. The market was absolutely flooded with Sonic content. Sonic reigned supreme during Mario's quiet years, but Nintendo's patience turned fruitful when they debuted their 64-bit all 3D console, the Nintendo 64. Leading the charge was Super Mario 64, a revolutionary platformer transforming the pleasures of classic Mario games into a three-dimensional space, with innovations in spatial movement, autonomous camera, and a visual splendor that had never been seen before, as well as a clever structure that allowed players to complete much of the game in any order. It was a remarkable achievement, and returned Mario to true prominence in video gaming. At the same time, the Sonic team had also been working on a 3D platformer they called Sonic X-Treme. The initial idea was that Sonic would operate from a fisheye point of view that was fixed on Sonic as the world rotated around him. But the Japanese and American factions of Sonic Team basically operated independently of each other, and that festered a lot of internal squabbling. There was a team trying to make it on the Genesis add-on 32X that fell apart due to what lead designer Chris Sen referred to as, quote, a politically unhealthy environment, end quote. Several other attempts fell through in planning stages as well, before being moved to the 32-bit Saturn, a console Sega of America was described as having disinterest in. There were still two separate teams working on separate parts of the game on Saturn, which sowed even more frustration and doubt. And the disparate teams had trouble attempting to integrate their two parts on a new 3D engine, of which the Saturn couldn't run fast enough. Apparently, an unidentified high-ranking official came by and hated one team's work, and insisted they rework the game around the others. At one point, they started trying to use the engine for Nights into Dreams, a well-liked platformer made by a group of Sonic team members, until ex-head Yuji Naka reportedly threatened to leave the company over it. Sega displayed a playable demo of Sonic X-Treme at the E3 Expo, but in the interim, both creative leads, Chris Sen and Chris Coffin, developed severe, stress-induced, potentially life-threatening illnesses, and with about 8 weeks until launch day, the game was finally, mercifully, cancelled. Because of this, the Saturn ended its short lifespan without an original Sonic game, and the failed production took so long that for some, Sonic felt like old news. The Nights into Dreams team decided to take a crack at it, starting over in 1997, and learning of the development of the Dreamcast, started working with greater hardware tech. Their original prototype ended up a bonus on the Saturn Sonic compilation, Sonic Jam. In an attempt to foster unity, the team for the new game, titled Sonic Adventure, welcomed all contributions, which ended up being, all told, over 100 people, a massive undertaking. If that feels like an overwhelming amount of stressful, conflicting, messy details, then I have properly communicated the essential synergy of the Sonic Adventure experience. A sprawling, fractured, overstuffed epic that absolutely feels like the work of 100 separate people contributing creatively. Sonic Adventure is as gorgeous as it is broken, as frustrating as it is charming. When you understand how many heated, shattered iterations it went through, you can see how it ended up with such a schizophrenic playstyle. When you know that multiple development heads literally almost died making the game, and the others wanted to kill each other, it starts feeling like a miracle that it exists at all, much less in playable form. Sonic Adventure absolutely operates on kitchen sink logic. This game has fully voiced cinematic cutscenes, a bunch of different random game mechanics like snowboarding or flight or car racing, has a half-dozen playable characters, each with their own individual stories, as well as a full built-in virtual pet RPG sim that is entirely optional. They focus grouped making Sonic slimmer and edgier, and the budget ballooned as they traveled internationally to research the layout for different levels, rebuilding them over and over and over, as if that could possibly have made any difference on 1999 hardware. Sonic Adventure is a lumbering behemoth of a game, so overstuffed with ideas and concepts and story and mechanics and innovations that it's hard to even encapsulate. This is not the sleek refinement of Super Mario 64, with its elegant castle hub and its clever, themed levels. This is hyperactive, flailing. This is, befitting the villain and the emeralds at the source of its narrative, chaos. The game is open-ended, but still brutally linear. Setups for levels are scattered all over its expansive, confusing worlds, often requiring you to find themed stones in nonsensical places that you are required to bring to other unclear places, simply to access the beginnings of levels, much less navigate through them, with your only guidance provided by psychotically vague hints like you may find something. The actual levels are a complete crapshoot, constantly marred by shaky controls, shoddy camera work, and unclear goals, all things mastered by Nintendo multiple years prior. Super Mario 64 had its moments of frustration with the camera, but overall it was quite intuitive and allowed you to navigate through the world with impressive normality. Sonic Adventure never figures out the central issue at its heart. It's important to display Sonic's trademark lightning speed, but in a way that maintains control for players. Instead, Sonic operates on only two settings: going so fast that you lose all sense of navigational control, and just cross your fingers that you won't fall off the side of something, or the game simply takes control away from you altogether and shows you a cute little QuickTime sequence before returning you to unsteady waters. There are small moments present here that allow you to see the game it could have been. The intoxication of being able to create in 3 dimensions overrides their good sense. Sonic X-treme understood that to establish that sense of speed in a way that remains navigable, you need to isolate one of the axes. Every so often in Sonic Adventure, there's a sequence that does this. The snowboarding level, or a scene where Sonic is running down the side of a building, and it manages to simulate the exhilaration they're going for. But these are woefully short, and too quickly we're back to clipping and crashing off the sides of any and every available structure. In addition, there's an enormous amount of random, time-wasting side games in other genres. Not counting the in-narrative flight combat levels on Tails' plane, there's things like slot car races, sports, fishing, pinball, gambling, and of course, chows. A whole series of little Tamagotchi life development things that you can train to fuse and level up and race and do all kinds of different things. And it's just insane that there's this whole other thing that you can spend hours and hours on, or completely miss altogether, and finish the game without ever noticing. In something like Disco Elysium, or the Yakuza series, that sort of density is charming and funny, because those games are so complex and compelling otherwise, that the idea that you can take a break from the intensity of its narrative to play some dumb little game is novel and amusing. But here, everything's so ramshackle that it feels more like a hyperactive kid in class, who didn't do the assigned homework, but tries to propose 6 other projects the class should totally do instead.
That's right, I forgot to go.
It's exhausting, and it makes you want to say, let's just try to be good at one thing before we do anything else. Speaking of that, did I mention that there are 6 characters in this game, and they all have their own individual storylines that you can play? Not just Sonic, but Tails, Knuckles, Sonic's girlfriend Amy, a robot that makes friends with Amy so they could do shooting levels, as well as a large purple cat named Big, who was literally put in the game because one of those 100 contributors wanted to put a fishing rod in and felt like they had to come up with a way to justify it. Most of the reviews at the time speak of Sonic Adventure as flawed but fascinating, and I think I can get on with that, to some extent. People had so much hope and desire for a 3D Sonic game to be good, and the overflowing amount of random shit to do was still a novelty in 1999. Even though a lot of the commenters speak on how broken a lot of the game is, it still got enough plaudits to be the 19th highest rated Dreamcast game on my metrics. But those reviews are all framed as hopeful, aspirational, that this is the first shaky step in the right direction for Sonic as a character, on his way to bigger and better things. Which, as we know, totally worked out. On first glance, that sheer spectacle of having so much to do and so much to see and so many characters can feel cool. But once you get into the meat of it, especially knowing the history, all I can see is a game that couldn't decide what it wanted to be, with too many creators who couldn't get along, with too many false starts on their resume. So everybody just threw all their ingredients in the same pot, and instead of refining the fundamentals, everybody just got their shit in and shipped it out. And so little of it truly, unequivocally works. It feels so close to being a good game that you play it aspirationally, just hoping it'll figure itself out. But walk with Sonic Adventure long enough, and eventually you just end up plummeting off another building. Next time, y'all ready to As a genre, boxing has had a weirdly difficult video game history. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Has long been considered one of the great and key games of the 8-bit era, and its Super NES sequel was well liked as well. But outside of those, the 90s is a wasteland of middling boxing titles. For every contender like 1991's arcade classic Title Fight, or 1993's relatively warmly received Greatest Heavyweights for the Genesis, there's a wide world of sports boxing, a world champ, 5 or 6 ports of George Foreman's KO boxing, Chavez, Riddick Bowe boxing, Muhammad Ali heavyweight boxing, or Foreman for real. Games that did little to differentiate themselves and were not well regarded. Boxing games were such a dying art that between 1996 and 1998, there was one single boxing game for any system, console, PC, or handheld, released in North America. That game was Electronic Arts' Knockout Kings, which came out in fall 1998 for the PlayStation 1, and received a bunch of polite reviews saying, "It's probably the best boxing game I've ever played. Anyway, I couldn't get into it. I give it a B-." The only other 32-bit boxing game up to this point was Center Ring Boxing for the Saturn, which is technically a 3D game, but also stars a series of jagged, anonymous, rock'em sock'em robots who really look like they gotta move these refrigerators. This is all preamble to establish just how not a slam dunk putting out a boxing game was in the 1999 video game market. Boxing has been considered a dying art for most of my lifetime. So much so that a common thread throughout all the boxing games of the last 4 or 5 full console generations is that every game's roster is either made up or is just 8 to 10 super famous boxers from 20 to 70 years prior, because there's not 8 to 10 boxers currently working that anybody knows. So if you're gonna do a boxing game in 1999 and get noticed, the thing you gotta do is you gotta do it with style. If you're not aiming for a dry, realistic boxing sim, what you're making is basically a fists-only fighting game, which gives you a lot more flexibility. Ready to Rumble Boxing is cartoony as hell, with goofy characters and magic power-up gloves. honestly, they could stand to be a little more cartoony, since some of these characters get a little questionable. Despite Ready to Rumble Boxing being available for basically every system possible at the time, including the Game Boy Color, the character Afro Thunder became one of the Dreamcast's sort of unofficial mascots. Thanks to a series of colorful advertisements presenting the characters of the Dreamcast lineup as a sort of workplace sitcom. He was also in a game-specific one where he wept after fellow boxer Butcher Brown accidentally ate a piece of his afro, and Brown's cornermen had to make him cough up a hairball. Just very light, silly stuff. One area that this game absolutely is not playing around on is the learning curve. Even on easy, the one-player championship mode is remarkably challenging. And while button mashing might get you lucky every now and then, this is a game that requires lots of skill, structure, and planning on how your punches are going to land and how you are going to block. Or even on the lowest rungs, these fighters will eat you alive. It's much more addicting on two-player versus mode, where nobody knows what the fuck they're really doing, and we're all just talking shit and swinging wildly. Some characters are lightning quick, some are enormous tanks, so we can pick and choose as nobody blocks and everybody yells and tries to figure out how to activate the stupid Rumble special move thing. Come on! And that's pretty much it for Ready to Rumble Boxing. This is not a deep game, and is fundamentally limited by its choice of genre. There's just only so much you can do with a boxing game, but it's a lot of fun for the time you have it. And in the annals of video game history, there's way less great boxing games than it feels like there should be, for a sport so closely linked and structured to the ever-popular fighting game genre. Other than Punch-Out, maybe no boxing game in history connected with audiences quite like Ready to Rumble Boxing, which combined responsive action with vivid, memorable characters. If you're looking for some boxing action, especially fun, silly 3D boxing action, it's as good as it gets. Up next, you ever traveled the globe to throw a park bench at a spooky mummy? Hideaki Itsuno knows fighting games. He got a job at Capcom in 1994, and was part of the team on the Street Fighter Alpha series, and Star Gladiator, a fighting game pushing then-current arcade hardware to 60 FPS. He saw space in the fighting genre for diversification of structure, and developed Rival Schools, a story-heavy fighting game with RPG elements that played around with wide-open level design. His next project, a fighting game set in the 1800s, reportedly inspired by Indiana Jones and Jackie Chan movies, was playing around even further with that exploration of space. And halfway through development, his team realized that, in full 3D, if they pulled the camera all the way up to an isometric angle, they could create an entirely new sort of fighting game. The game was called Power Stone, and it was innovating a genre that came to be known as the arena battle game, where the strategy is not memorizing a series of exact, complex button combinations, but instead being active in a three-dimensional stage, a space with a remarkable amount of weapons, projectiles, and other devices already present. and then prizes are randomly distributed throughout the contest. Things like swords, guns, bombs, as well as a series of titular power stones that, if obtained in order, provide a remarkable and devastating boost of strength. Being developed independently at almost the exact same time as the game that defined the arena battle genre, Nintendo's Super Smash Bros., Power Stone came up with a lot of the same ideas, but deployed in a much different way. Smash Bros., for all its craziness, is still relatively two-dimensional, working left to right and right to left. Power Stone is fully three-dimensional, running between upstage and downstage, on stairs, on platforms. And essentially everything in the stage is interactive, which really leans into the delightful chaos. Now, just because this isn't Soulcalibur's exacting combo string does not mean that there isn't strategy here. This is a straightforward game, but it's not a basic one, and you're persistently making estimations for placement and strategy. You're constantly sticking and moving, charting the quickest path to weapons, or especially the stones, to string together enough to take down your opponent. Power Stone was a huge hit, but became something of a cult item legacy-wise. The Dreamcast didn't have a long cultural tale, and Smash Bros.' every famous character from the history of Nintendo roster connected a little more long-term than Power Stone's charming group of whimsical anime vagabonds. But God, it deserves better. When I put out a general request for my friends and followers to name the first game they think of when they think of the Dreamcast, I had over a dozen people name Power Stone. This game is addicting and involving, with the randomness of the weapon drops, and the bedlam built into the structure, making sure that every matchup is an interesting, wild, competitive one, keeping it from just simply becoming the most experienced player dominating. The only thing I could think of to really improve upon Power Stone would just be to expand it to 4 players. 1v1 is so much fun, but if they're leaning into the mayhem, I wish they'd gone just a little farther, because otherwise, this is as much fun as I've had with a fighting game in years. Up next, y'all ready to slam some boats? Midway must have been bored. That's the only reason I can think of for their top 2 launch titles for the Sega Dreamcast being 2 genres that nobody makes games on: boxing and boat racing. We've discussed the difficulty with creating a popular boxing game, but Midway did it thanks to stylish, colorful advertising with ready-to-rumble boxing. The problem with making a boat racing game in 1999 is it's on water, and water is f***ing hard. Similar to the lack of boxing games in the years immediately preceding Ready to Rumble's release, the watercraft racing genre was pretty much an open, empty landscape upon which Midway could imprint whatever they wanted. The only real watercraft racer of any kind since the 8-bit era was Nintendo's acclaimed, in-house developed early Nintendo 64 jet ski game, Wave Race 64. That game was gorgeous and handled like a dream, but the 64 was a console of limited releases, and the other contemporary attempts on the sea were all varying degrees of ugly or squirrely. And there's such a razor-thin line for both when it comes to water-based competition. But Midway was apparently looking for another new challenge. and produced Hydro Thunder for the arcades in early spring 1999. And since the Dreamcast had an identical tech layout to Sega's arcade machines, it was an easy port over. It was also ported to the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, and those ports look and play fine. But the Dreamcast's is phenomenal on all counts. The water effects, a notoriously difficult thing to animate, look tremendous, and what feel like very realistic floating physics. The levels are cartoony but vivid, with a handful of turns and drops that legitimately wowed me. A common theme among the best Dreamcast launch titles is precision. Not only visual sharpness, but control. An important balance between pick-up-and-play fun and addicting expertise. And Hydro Thunder for the Dreamcast has some of the most responsive controls I've ever experienced in a racing game. Most racing games are built around attempting realistic movement and physics, and Hydro Thunder, set on the water, has plenty of that sort of intentional drift. But maybe no racing game I've ever played is able to so quickly and accurately act out the intention of your turns. There are more realistic racing sims coming up in this project, and their exacting standards are so high that my experiences sent me fishtailing into the wall on a regular basis. Hydro Thunder is so reactive, it feels like it's hooked into your brain, able to communicate left when you want left, and drift when you want drift. That sense of aim feels notable, especially for a series for enormous crafts set on water, and especially when so much of the difference between winning and losing is being able to angle yourself to get power-ups strewn about the level. Now, this is not to say that Hydro Thunder is in any way easy. Just because your boat is responsive, and you can get all the power-ups, doesn't mean that you're racing against a bunch of chumps, and you can cruise through the levels. All the other racers, of which there are 15 per race, have boats that run just as fast and turn just as well. So you really have to race near flawlessly to even have a chance of placing top 3 by the end. Case in point, I've played Hydro Thunder for quite a few hours in the last few months, and I've never even come close to completing the placement needed to beat even the medium tracks. Often, I'm having trouble even hitting enough checkpoints to finish the medium races. And there's 2 other levels of racetrack left. But that sense of control, coupled with that sense of speed, really makes it an addicting experience that you want to keep coming back to. You feel compelled to keep trying because the game is challenging while not feeling like you're being cheated in any way. As far as complaints, I have very little. Although there's definitely some very 1999 cultural insensitivity built into some of the exotic levels. Case in point, there's a jungle level that has natives throwing spears at you from the shoreline. Also, I laughed very hard that the medium levels name a specific lake in Utah, but homogenize the entirety of countries in Eastern Asia as the Far East, which is then filled with a bunch of random, stereotypical hip and gable roofs. But those are small points in a phenomenal game. One I've played much, much longer than I had to for a stream or to obtain footage for this video. There's been very, very few racing games I've been compelled to play this often. But it's just so involving, so challenging, and looks so nice and controls so well, it's hard to ask for more than Hydro Thunder provides. Next time, whose house? One of the most distinctive things you can do to gain attention in the arcades is with a peripheral cabinet. You got a motorcycle game? The controller is a motorcycle. We're flying a spaceship? Get in the cockpit. Maybe the most common arcade peripheral is the light gun, in which your controller, as you might have guessed, is a gun that you aim at the screen and fire. This actually goes back to a pre-video era, with mechanical gun games like Life Targets dating back to the early 1900s. In the video game era, from Wild Gunman to Operation Wolf to Mad Dog McCree to Terminator 2, light gun games have always been a part of the arcade experience. And by 1995, they were truly having something of a resurgence, thanks to prominent games like Area 51, Time Crisis, and Point Blank. Sega's top in-house team stepped back into this arena with The House of the Dead. Inspired by Western horror films, especially zombie flicks like the George Romero Dead movies, Sega pulled the engine from their other light gun rail shooter series, Virtua Cop, but aimed for a more mature crowd. The game is set during a biochemical outbreak at a mansion in Europe. Weirdly, 1996's other prominent zombie horror game, Resident Evil, is also set in a mansion, and you are one of two agents that have to pump rounds of quarters to shoot waves of zombies. Home consoles have an equally long history of weapon-based peripheral controllers, from the NES's Zapper to Super Nintendo's Super Scope, the Genesis's Menacer, say that 5 times fast, and the PlayStation's Gun-Con. House of the Dead was ported home on the Sega Saturn, around the same time that House of the Dead 2 was hitting arcades. Part 2 was equally successful, and as such, found its way to the Dreamcast as one of 19 launch titles. The second game focuses on two different agents, with the whitest American man names of all time, traveling through Venice to fight the zombie horde. The original game's protagonist, whose name is G...
We're meeting G over there. Please be safe, G. G!
shows up for a moment here to pass on a journal showing you every villain's weak spots. Part 2 is visually lovely, but has all the same foibles as the first game. It's fun, but sort of mindless, repetitive fun. It's short, it's a straight port of the arcade, so it's arcade length, and the writing, and especially the voice acting, is hysterically poor.
Gary!
Amy, Harry!
Thank God you're alright.
What the hell's going on in this city?
Don't know, but it's very similar to the 1998 Tyrion case.
That case?
James, go and prevent the confusion in the city.
Okay.
Let's meet at Sunset Bridge.
We're counting on you, Gary.
Leave it to me.
But Sega made one major decision that truly kneecapped the Dreamcast version of the House of the Dead 2. In the time between the game's Japanese console release in March 1999 and its American release as a Dreamcast launch title in September, the Columbine High School Massacre happened. And this spurred a debate about what might have caused these children to take these actions. And one of the main scapegoats that arose was violent video games. So to avoid any sort of backlash, Sega decided to still release House of the Dead 2 as a launch title for the Dreamcast, but not provide any light gun support whatsoever. Yes, unless you get a rare third-party peripheral, or buy a full Japanese Dreamcast, you are limited to playing a game designed for free-aim, split-second precision by having to slowly drag a cursor around the screen. If you think this sounds like trying to play Guitar Hero with controller buttons, in that it's technically possible but sort of miserable and clearly not how it was designed to be played, you're absolutely right. And fights against villains like the zippy and minuscule Zeal become deeply frustrating and utterly tedious prayers for lucky shots. And that's basically the read on House of the Dead 2. It's a game whose positive reputation lies entirely in the fact that it's fun to do shooty shoots with your friends at the bar, and basically nothing else. And the Dreamcast port says, what if we give you everything except the thing you like about this? Visually it is nice, but after a while, that lack of precision on those godforsaken cursors just killed us so often that we turned on no death cheats just to see what the rest of the game had in store. And inexplicably, there's only 3 big boss monsters that the game just cycles through over and over, and you can beat the entire thing in about half an hour. It is, in every way, a game that is designed for a communal arcade experience. An experience that the Dreamcast can't, and in fact won't, provide. Next time, learning how to drive a real Formula 1 car might actually be easier. Simulation in video games is a complex concept. In striving to recreate a real-life experience in a genuine way, it's always a fine line. Make it too broadly approachable, and you risk boring the hardcore audience that might be interested. Make it too exacting, and you take a chance on alienating a general, casual audience from making your game a financial success. On the topic of feeling alienated in regards to today's subject, my response is
take me to your leader.
Because Monaco Grand Prix might very well be the most difficult, exacting, brutally unforgiving racing sim I have ever played. Formula 1 racing fandom is its own breed to begin with. Contrasted with the straightforward, four-to-the-floor power of NASCAR oval racing, Formula 1 is done on winding road courses and, in many cases, actual streets, restructured to fit a bunch of high-performance automobiles. Instead of the blistering muscle of stock cars, Formula 1 is about strategy, slowly inching your way around hairpin turns and choosing when to sprint and when not to, as you can't just mash the throttle and expect to blow away the competition. As you might imagine, this experience has been recreated in video game form. Ubisoft first created a racing game called F1 Racing Simulation in 1997 for the PC, and it was popular enough to gain a sequel, which was retitled Monaco Grand Prix for the console market. With this game, Ubisoft very distinctly aimed for the hardcore F1 racing fan, because this game is cerebral and ruthlessly exacting in a way that is sort of stunning. You have to be absolutely on your shit at all times. If you touch the barriers, you spin out. If you touch the grass, you spin out. If you touch the dirt, you spin out. Sometimes you hit a lengthy straightaway and follow it with a 180-degree turn, and no matter how many laps I did, I was never able to quite recollect that it was coming up once again, and woe was me. And let me tell you, many laps I did. This game is run on a timed checkpoint metric, so if you're trying to crawl through the wiggling turns to make sure you're clearing them, you're going to fail, early and often. Nearly every track on this game requires a 6 or 7 lap run, and it took me more than a full half hour of gameplay to even reach lap 3. I didn't actually finish a race until more than 90 minutes after I turned the game on. Not like win a race, or like place top 5. Finish any race. The learning curve on the exacting, specific controls of this game is so ridiculously, preposterously high that it's almost offensive that it's asking you to even consider competing against others on top of it. This had the specificity of a farming simulator, or one of those ludicrously precise Steam indie game sims. But for those games, the meticulous specificity is the appeal, the novelty of just doing a hard thing you wouldn't think of in video game form. But car racing does not contain that novelty, and if you played a game called Toddler Learning How to Ride a Bike on Training Wheels Simulator, chances are it wouldn't also have a Tour de France mode. When I was finally able to complete one race by the skin of my teeth, there was no fanfare at all, to the point that I initially thought I had failed. It didn't even say finish, but I knew that I had done it. And that's all that mattered. Once I finally completed that, I decided to back out and check out the other modes. And to my horror, I realized that the mode I had been playing was arcade mode. That's right. The game that I was playing, the most exacting racing simulation I have ever played by a wide margin, was on the casual difficulty. This was the fun version, the pick up and play version. It gets more complicated and more difficult and more specific from here. I just yelled, "No! No!" and furiously smashed the back button so I could try retro mode. Shortly after I got in there, you'll be shocked to know that cars from the 1950s do not magically handle easier in this game than cars from the late 90s, and things went south immediately. If you are a fan of Formula One racing and have the desire and the patience to experience a painstaking recreation of your favorite motorcar sport, maybe this is for you. The graphics are nice. And if the regular soundtrack is that same kind of generic waiting room techno that every other Dreamcast game seems to have. The simulation mode, where you can customize all the random little gears on the car, seems in-depth, if that's your scene. Ultra-hard games can be charming if the point is that they're ultra-hard. That's the appeal of those ridiculous indie sims. But if the absurd difficulty is simply incidental to a game that otherwise expects you to have regular, competitive fun, that can grow quickly frustrating if the game doesn't have much else around it. Monaco Grand Prix assumes that if you're here, you know what you're in for, but it's so rigorously strict that it just isn't any fun, even if that's on purpose. Next time, take me down to the hoverboard city, where the copyrights are infringed and the men are in their 40s for some reason. If you've ever been playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, but found yourself wishing the controls were floatier and less exact, and the game had drastically more unclear goals, have I got a game for you. Here comes Trickstyle, a super cool, super hip, super futuristic racing game that seems to have all the passion and energy of a class project started the morning of. That lack of inspiration for most of the game's details presents itself right away. The character selection screen is a hysterical combination of random men in their 40s for some reason, and just straight up stealing intellectual property. The actual meat of the game is sort of a bouncing hybrid between racing levels and Tony Hawk-esque trick challenges. There are quite a few races, but for all of them, it feels like the developers' hearts aren't quite in it. There's not much in the way of compelling competition, the courses are impersonally designed, the controls are janky, the game's insistence on attaching yourself to luge lines as a mode of transportation is nightmarishly inexact and causes nothing but major issues. There's no sense of exhilaration, and the game punishes you severely for even slight collisions with any and all parts of the course, which is an odd, ruthless detail for such an arcadey racer. Also, the game gives you points for tricks during races in a way that does not appear to amount to anything. The game is also brutally linear. Hitting one obstacle during races, or missing any of the myriad luge lines in the timed trick competitions, basically guarantees your failure. And there's no way within the game's tight schedule to double back or check off some others while you try again. Everything has to proceed exactly right, or it's back to the sad board-sitting animation for you. The two-player mode is, if anything, even more unrelenting. They have trick competitions that require you to make it to 20,000 points to win, but the tricks you perform are so low wattage, and the bonuses are preposterously difficult to obtain and only provide either 10 or 5 seconds extra time. We had to enter a series of cheats, one of which is Travolta for some reason, to stop the pounding clock, and even then, we had to go about 3 times over the actual time frame limit to even have one of us attain 20,000 points once. It's just such a ludicrous measure to require players to attain in what could simply be a who gets more competition. There is one major exception to that linear structure. In one of the weirdest design decisions I've ever seen, they have built the entire menu selection into the physical world, which is interesting, but also leads to bizarre situations, especially in multiplayer, where you're in the middle of a competition, and if you stray too far down one of the barely labeled pathways, the game simply supersedes whatever you were doing to start a new thing. Multiple times, I found myself canceling trick competitions because I had accidentally drifted into the tunnel for UK race number 2, or even the character select screen, which is also an approachable physical landmark in the world. This game was created by Criterion Games. No, not that one. That one. Who, just over 2 years after Trickstyle, released the first game in the Burnout series, a beloved franchise of car crash racing sims whose main appeal was its psychotically detailed and accurate physics engine. That game also barely cared about its racing sequences, but the team managed to integrate its passions more fully into a playable structure. Considering that the same year, this team also released a spiritual successor to Trickstyle called Airblade, which got a nearly identical critical response, almost to the letter, it's clear that Criterion's true interest was just in the realistic hoverboard physics, and everything else was just perfunctory. That's how you end up with, Baby Spice, M. Bison, and Power Ranger. I don't know, we gotta go, thanks. Even if you're a fan of these sorts of extreme sports games, I would say give Trickstyle a pass. Between the lazy character designs, the woefully inexact controls, the savagely unforgiving time restraints and level designs, and the bland, uninspired visuals, it just doesn't seem to have been constructed in the hopes that you'd have a lot of fun with it. If all they gave a shit about was the physics engine, maybe this should have stayed a tech demo. Next time, are you ready to be pretty good? In 1979, software engineer Bruce Artwick released a program for Apple computers called FS1 to rave reviews. This was the very first home product in the genre of flight simulation. Contrasted to the much more common flight combat sims, flight sims appeal to people who are looking to simulate the experience of how to fly an aircraft, without all those pesky lasers and bombs. But this is a genre that has existed almost entirely on personal computers. Thanks to the more cerebral setting, this can function as much as a piece of software, alongside CD-ROM encyclopedias and arts and crafts programs, as it is a video game. Conversely, the history of flight sims released on consoles was shockingly scant. As of September 9th, 1999, there had been a grand total of 4 games that qualified as flight-only simulators in the history of console gaming. Space Shuttle dropped for the Atari 2600 in 1983, followed by a 5200 port the following year. 7 years later, in 1991, Space Shuttle Project followed, late in the NES's life cycle. The other 2 were Pilot Wings, a 1991 launch title for the Super Nintendo, and its sequel, Pilot Wings 64, a 1996 launch title for the Nintendo 64. That's not just the good ones. That's all of them. There is a maddening masterpiece of a game called RC Stunt Copter that came out for PlayStation about a month after September 9th, but on 9/9/99, that's all we have as a lead-in for Arrow Wings. Now, I admittedly haven't played those Space Shuttle games, but the Pilot Wings series was a favorite of mine as a child, mostly because it took the possibly foreboding flight sim genre and made it colorful, catchy, and fun, with a series of different types of flying craft. Pilot Wings 64 especially had a jazzy island serenity to it that made it a joy to sift through, even if the tasks could be quite difficult. On the other hand, there's Arrow Wings. I have absolutely no idea what the actual main mode of Arrow Wings might specifically be, because the little training tasks are so stuffed to the gills with instructions, and yet are so ruthlessly unhelpful when it comes to actual guidance, that I would venture to guess most people aren't even able to get through them to access whatever the primary mode might be. They dump you into these trainings by unfurling a series of numbers for different metrics that they expect you to adhere to the digit. Many times, you will have no indication you've done anything wrong until the game's amusingly overzealous drill instructor starts screaming at you. Even on the rare times that you actually succeed in the tasks, the response for scoring in the 80s or even the 90s out of 100 points is pretty good. A call that has become something of a meme in our household.
Plus. Yes!
Pretty good.
Pretty good!
Pretty good.
That's what an 87 gets you. Tough love with this teacher.
I have no idea if the game has a compliment above pretty good. The problem with this game is that there is so much homework, and yet you receive so little assistance or support that it's not only unclear how to do these tasks, but if you're doing them for anything, that there will be any sort of edifying, emotional, or action set piece after this. The game does have a series of challenges that are just flying through a lot of rings in different environments, but it's not clear if those are side missions or the payoff you're supposed to be performing in the trainings for. There's technically also a multiplayer mode for up to 4 players, but that mode is entirely based around performing complicated formations. And considering I've played the formation training dozens of times, and literally never once got even one thing correct on them, with absolutely zero indication of what I'm doing wrong or how to correct it, I have to say that there's just no way to find any joy in multiplayer mode either. The idea that Arrow Wings expects not only you, but up to 3 of your friends to have gone through its stern, rigorous training slog to be able to do anything in tandem is almost offensive. I admit that I've never spent much time in the flight simulator genre, but I can see the appeal. The idea of being able to learn and do all of the things required of you to operate an actual aircraft is a fun concept, And those sorts of PC works that feel like educational reference guides with neat visuals seem cool. Arrow Wings also looks fairly nice, but that lack of clarity about literally any part of this experience is really what limits the effectiveness of the game generally. All the period reviews I read said that they enjoyed it, but worried that casual gamers were not going to get very far and would just bail because of its high learning curve and nebulous structure. And guess what? They're right. Arrow Wings sucks because it demands tasks of you, barely shows you how to do them, and then yells at you for failing, all in service of absolutely nothing. On console, there just isn't a history or a market for a game like this. So to make it palatable for the arena you're releasing it into, you have to make the game feel welcoming and fun. Something like Pilot Wings that will guide you and charm you. Or, accepting that, you need it to be quirky and addicting. The aforementioned RC Stuntcopter, for example, is harder and more ruthless than Cuphead and Super Meat Boy put together, and I have never had a game that has made me angrier, but also motivated me to keep playing, because RC Stuntcopter has very clear goals, and how to attain them. It's more like a claw game, something that's preposterously difficult, but addicting, because the controls are so responsive in a way where you feel like you got it if you could just get it. And that scratches a nice itch. Arrow Wings never manages to make a case for itself. You fail, and it yells at you, and you try it again, and you fail, and it yells at you. And never once do you feel like you've got it. It just says, turn the plane, and then you try, and it beeps at you, so you stop, and then it tells you you failed, and you have to try again. But it never makes a compelling case as to why you should try again, especially when there were 18 other games to play on launch day. Case in point, after failing yet another frustrating training, I decided to just watch a long play to at least see what I couldn't get to. And I discovered that on YouTube, Arrow Wings has no long plays. I couldn't find a single video that would show me even what the next training might be, much less the moon level, the game's one apparent concession to anything approaching whimsy. Apparently, nobody wanted to spend any comprehensive amount of time with Arrow Wings. By the way, the game's soundtrack is that same weird, stale, canned techno that every other Dreamcast launch title has, but this one features a recurring voice sample of a woman saying, "They've got you groovin'!" And I just had to add that I'm not sure I have ever played a game that qualifies as less groovin' than Arrow Wings. Next time, who knew that the only thing holding football back was that it wasn't violent enough?
One of the fundamental tenets of creating and advertising products in the late 1990s, especially products geared towards young people, was that it had to be extreme. And just to clarify, that's extreme, spelled with a less than usually present amount of ease. The music, angry. The hats, backwards. There wasn't anything that couldn't be presented as louder, dumber, or more violent than the norm. Somehow, this could even include football, which was already as violent as athletic competitions got, without being full ECW. Now, for pretty much my entire childhood, I spent basically every weekend at Monaco Lane's bowling alley in southeast Denver, where my parents and grandparents had bowled in leagues longer than I'd been alive. Me and my bowling alley friends mostly spent our evenings roaming the building, but usually ended up at the arcade, scamming quarters to play whatever the new machine was.
This particular new machine was a football game. Now, in the winter of 1997-1998, 9-year-old me found most sports, especially football, fairly tedious, and not worthy of my attention when I could just play Mortal Kombat 3 or whatever instead. Normally, I wouldn't give a sports game the time of day, but it was 1998, and my hometown Denver Broncos had just won their very first championship. So it was quite easy to get caught up in Super Bowl fever. Plus, this football game was from Midway, who also did the aforementioned Mortal Kombat 3. Midway also made the highly influential NBA Jam, which was not the first simplified, over-the-top, goofy basketball game, but it was the first to find true mainstream success. It took basketball, but cut the number of players from 5 to 2, and mostly focused on being able to do bitchin' dunks. And if your dunks were bitchin' enough, your ball would literally light on fire. Midway wanted to do the same thing with football, and so they created NFL Blitz, which to my 9-year-old eyes didn't look or sound anything like the dry, boring football games I was familiar with. It was 7-on-7, cutting 4 players on each side. The plays were basic schoolyard stuff. The controls were simple and mostly run through the joystick. The game automated extra points because those are boring stuff. The other twists were that you had to go 30 yards for a first down instead of 10, and there was no penalties. You could hit receivers before the pass got to them, and you could do all manner of wrestling moves to them after the whistle. It was, for lack of a better word, extreme. It was, apparently, initially, a little too extreme for the folks at the National Football League, who were apparently expecting something a little more silly and cartoony like NBA Jam, not really being willing to acknowledge that in an over-the-top version of professional football, the only thing you can really ramp up is the violence. They apparently forced Midway's hand to some extent, and got them to tone down a lot of the most egregiously savage things, which, especially now that I've got 25 years of football sims in my gaming history, leads to NFL Blitz honestly playing a bit too close to regular, ordinary football. As a result, NFL Blitz is not an extreme version of football, so much as it is just a messy, needlessly chaotic one. The supposed simplification in directional passing just makes things less exact than each character having a button assigned to them, since characters are changing directions so often. And the ability to take down receivers pre-catch just leads to a lot of incompletions and punts. Exactly the opposite of the all-killer, no-filler experience the game is purporting to have. By the way, in case you're wondering what the difference is between NFL Blitz and NFL Blitz 2000, the game I'm actually technically reviewing, the answer is literally almost nothing. NFL Blitz 2000 is technically a home port of NFL Blitz 99, an arcade follow-up to the original that is so identical that most game websites don't even differentiate between them. The only major difference is apparently that 2000 has added a perfunctory, pretty bare-bones season mode, which I did not play to completion to see if there is a perfunctory, bare-bones championship celebration. The game is, admittedly, gorgeous aesthetically. Player models are shiny and exaggerated, and we played it so often growing up that pretty much every sound effect here is permanently burned into my brain, every noise triggering an unconscious memory of childhood. I think the less you know about the game of football itself, the more likely you are to really enjoy NFL Blitz. It's loud and shiny and angry, and purports to not be your daddy's football or whatever, but is mostly just a blaringly noisy, thinned-out version of the real thing, with drastically less replay value. It's Chuck E. Cheese on a skateboard with a backwards hat. I mean, hell, NFL 2K had a bunch of Arn Anderson spinebuster tackles too. And here, after the first 3 or 4 post-play Macho Man elbows, it starts losing its charm. Now, this is not to say that asking Midway to tone down their ideas is necessarily a bad thing. In 2004, once Electronic Arts got the exclusive NFL license for their Madden series, Blitz developers took it as an impetus to indulge in all their most egregiously inappropriate tendencies, with 2005's M-rated, absolutely psychotic Blitz the League, which features Mortal Kombat-esque X-ray bone breaks and allows players to take steroids on the sideline to recover quicker from injuries. It's that f***ing game. But as far as Blitz 2000 goes, I'm not 10 anymore. And I loved actual football for many, many years after. Years that have made me realize how tepid an exaggeration NFL Blitz 2000 truly is, adding only more muddy confusion to a sport that is already plenty violent enough, without enough of the novelty or levity that NBA Jam possessed, to really make a worthwhile case to keep coming back for more. Next time, y'all ever wanted to go flag to flag? One of the strangest things to me about the launch day roster for the Dreamcast was not only how many games there were on opening night, but also how many of them sort of tread the same stylistic ground, while being just different enough. For instance, there were 3 fighting games, but at least they're relatively different styles. There were 2 football games, but at least one of them is sober and the other is cartoony. There are 2 games where you fly airplanes, but at least one you shoot missiles and the other you just get yelled at. Hey, are you out of your mind? But among the 5 car racing titles at launch, there were 2 open-wheel racing games, and I can't imagine those 2 together did either game any favors. The more high-profile was Monaco Grand Prix, a maniacally exacting Formula 1 sim that had an absolutely bananas-high learning curve that alienated all but the most hardcore F1 fans. The other was Kart, Flag to Flag. Not cart, but CART, the governing body tortuously backronymed into Championship Auto Racing Teams, who ran the IndyCar series until 1996, when a schism with the president of Indianapolis Motor Speedway, the crown jewel of open-wheel tracks, spurred by disagreements over branding and money and standings, caused the founding of a new league, the Indy Racing League. Between this split and the growing popularity of NASCAR, CART was kind of a dead league walking by the time this game released, and would go out of business and be absorbed into the IRL a scant 4 years later, in 2003. But it's not 2003, it's 1999, and we are at KB Toys to pick up a Sega Dreamcast on launch day. But oh no, we got there late! And the only game left on the shelf is CART, Flag to Flag. As a contrast to Monaco Grand Prix's exacting demands, Flag to Flag is almost absurdly casual. The game is basically entirely straightforward oval tracks, as opposed to MGP's maddening street courses, and the controls are almost too responsive. You slow down a little in the grass, but overall this has some unnaturally precise swerving, and even on hard difficulty I found myself destroying the competition within minutes of turning it on. Now, while I enjoy winning races much more than being entirely unable to finish any, this is, in its own way, just as frustrating as Grand Prix's ludicrous difficulty. The presentation here is also disappointingly bare bones. Monaco Grand Prix had an inexplicably bitchin' theme song, one that really got me hyped for an experience that game was not interested in delivering. Flag to Flag has no intro whatsoever, just a simple title screen with one and a menu screen that is dead silent. The character select screen and actual gameplay do have a generic little theme, but it is consistently drowned out by the absolutely deafening engine noise. Dig these sweet sounds. Earplugs are common for trips to the actual racetrack, but I don't think I've ever played a video game that would benefit from such decibel dampening. And sadly, that's pretty much all Kart Flag to Flag has to offer. It is exactly what it is, from the moment you start it to the moment you wander away to pick another game. I was looking forward to this game because I have a lot of memories of my dad being a big fan of lots of non-NASCAR racing leagues. And from posters and t-shirts of his favorite driver Little Al, who I got to play as in this game, to occasional trips out to Pikes Peak International Raceway, I was bringing some connections to this that felt unique. So I was sad to find that this was such a rudimentary experience. Now don't get me wrong, I would play this 1,000 times before I popped in Monaco Grand Prix by choice again. Just simply because being able to pick up and play a laughably easy racing game is preferable to a game that spends its entire playtime with both middle fingers firmly extended in my face. But honestly, at least MGP would have replay value for its audience. MGP is unequivocally a deeper game, even if that depth feels to me like diving into the pit of syringes from Saw 2. Kart Flag to Flag is more like a high dive belly flop into Jello. It doesn't taste bad, but you hit that wall quick. If you must have a racing sim among the Dreamcast launch titles, please, by all means, pick up Hydro Thunder, which is gorgeous, forgiving, and still compellingly challenging, and leave these two dweebs to fight among themselves. Next time, you ever been on vacation to Dinosaur Island and roundhouse kicked a spider person and had them give you 6 coins? As of 1999, one of gaming's youngest, freshest, most recently established subgenres was the style of survival horror. Named and encapsulated by 1996's smash hit Resident Evil, survival horror was defined by its dark, spooky narratives, its baroque presentation, and its reliance on item scarcity, turning playthroughs into nerve-wracking puzzles of conservation and survival. Climax Entertainment, the developers of the game Blue Stinger, said their game was less survival horror and more monster adventure action, which makes sense, both because items are far from scarce, and that the only thing scary here is the incomprehensibility of its storyline. We'll get into the nitty-gritty about this game's issues with camera work and level design in just a minute, but I would be doing you a disservice if I did not start this video discussing Blue Stinger's plot and setup, which is as deliriously unhinged and utterly befuddling as any game I have ever played. The first thing you see when you start a new game is the on-screen title 65 million BC. That's right. We're in the Yucatan Peninsula, where one of the meteorites that wiped out the dinosaurs caused an island to develop, which they have named Dinosaur Island. Now, in the year 2018, we meet Elliot, 1T, who is an elite member of some sort of vague sea rescue service. It's Christmas time,
and Elliot is on vacation, on a boat, wearing proper Christmas vacation boat attire, along with his friend, who is very proud of his angel in a bottle? Anyway, something falls from the sky and causes the island to be sealed under a dome, which bisects the boat, trapping Elliot inside. A light takes the shape of the bottle angel just as creatures descend upon the boat and destroy it as Elliot flees for shore. This is the first 3 minutes of this game. Elliot makes it to shore and meets a grumpy sea captain named Dogs.
Dogs!
And they fight through monsters together until they hear from a woman named Janine, who helps them to safety even as they both act instantly inappropriately towards her. Elliot starts being inexplicably, relentlessly horny towards this woman before he's even met her.
I like it, Janine.
Who the hell is Janine?
My kind of girl, so stay away from her.
The developers described Elliot as basically a flirt, a fun-loving type that women are quick to fall in love with, which is, 1, absolutely not in evidence, and 2, an insane way to sum up your action horror protagonist. And in practice, it just manifests as baffling impropriety, especially for the situation.
Nephilim is following us. Seems like she's in love with you.
2 girls and a guy. I see trouble in the near future.
Later on, Elliot fights a creature whose vomit he accidentally swallows.
What's wrong?
I think I swallowed some of the monster vomit.
And it turns him into a purple monster who can crawl on the ceiling for, like, the entire middle section of the game. Yes, Dogs is dressed as Santa. No, I don't really know why. Once he's cured, the team discovers that the meteorite that hit 65 million years ago was actually some sort of dinosaur egg that the scientists were working with, and now it's active, and the angel is the spirit of the meteorite. We have to kill the dinosaur, etc., etc., etc. I don't know. Anyway. A game this ridiculous, this apeshit baddie, would be absolutely iconic for its weirdness if it was even the least bit playable. The reason you most likely haven't heard of Blue Stinger before is that playable, it very much isn't. One of the main defining features of Resident Evil's brand of survival horror are its sharp, dramatic camera angles. Blue Stinger's Japanese release had a sort of automated cinematic camera that tried to find cool angles in a 3D space, which is admirable even if it's sort of dizzying. The American release inexplicably removed this entirely and just went straight third person, but the floating camera is so squirrely that it's even more nauseating. This is made even worse by the fact that seemingly 95% of the experience of playing Blue Stinger is just tedious, endless wandering through repetitive spaces. Some of the levels are distinctive, and pre-release interviews said the developers tried to model the settings on actual places they went to, grocery stores, clubs, movie theaters, etc. But actually navigating through the space is cumbersome, bordering on impossible, and it's remarkably easy to get turned around. Where Resident Evil is pretty linear by nature, this is woefully obtuse, to the point that I'm not entirely sure how someone would beat this game without a guide. Especially for some of the game's more wildly unclear fetch quests, which it seems to try to mitigate by occasionally serving you ludicrously lengthy countdown challenges.
I have 42 minutes to get his medicine. There's a 42-minute counter?
Yeah.
This endlessly recursive meandering becomes even more wearying thanks to the oppressive soundtrack, which makes the absolutely insane decision to make every single sequence sound like a boss battle. A non-stop
pounding that grows viscerally exhausting. Especially as you're doubling back through identical-looking hallways to try and track down some sort of vague key to a room you can't find. The music changes for different areas, but none of the tracks are any less blaring, and it keeps you on edge the entire time, but not in a good way. In a way that makes you want to just bail as soon as possible.
I just need to stop. That's all I need.
Yes!
This game is also filled to the brim with ugly, boring, deeply unsatisfying combat. Pretty much any enemy in the game requires 10 to 15 bullets minimum, and the camera works extremely hard to make it as difficult as possible to aim at anything specific. I talked about scarcity of items not being an issue here, mostly because the game provides random vending machines, seemingly every 15 feet. And every monster you kill just explodes with coins when you kill them. So you really never have to do much strategizing in your inventory.
A roundhouse kicked a spider person, and it gave me 6 coins.
I rarely, if ever, came close to dying, because those coins also allowed me to purchase considerable health boosts in the form of an indeterminate beverage called a Hassie, as well as a hamburger that, in a funny detail of overlooked localization, costs $160. Instead, creatures are simply annoying impediments you have to bypass by mashing one button over and over as you fight with your real enemies. Bad camera work, draining music loops, and general boredom and frustration. Every part of Blue Stinger is weird and awkward and
Santa's
funny
outfit size-
and worth talking about, except for the actual act of playing the game, which unfortunately compromises nearly all of the experience. This demented little thing absolutely feels like it should be a cult item, with its vague, psychotic plot, its inane, bizarre, dubbed dialogue, its mind-boggling soundtrack, the limited graphics. Special shout out to the game simulating breathing by having every character do a full body hump puppy pant. Also, in-universe, both Elliot and Dogs are supposed to be traveling together, but they apparently only have enough to animate one, so the other just appears out of thin air during cutscenes. But all of these things come together to make a game that is long, and tedious, and exhausting, and ugly, and bad. It asks for so much of your time, and gives you very little back in kind. I can't recommend ever spending any real time with this one. But if someone ever feels up to slicing through the long play to make a cutscene supercut, we might all at least get to laugh together. Next time, y'all ready to merge politely? For all their variables in speed, setting, and type, racing games, as a genre, tend to pretty much boil down to the same thing. Hustling through a fixed route, trying to do it faster and more efficiently than your officially registered opponents. The Tokyo Extreme Racer series, conversely, innovated a more novel approach. Set on Japan's Shuto Expressway, and more specifically Route B, the Bayshore route, the Wangan Highway, made famous by the popular 1990 street racing manga Wangan Midnight. These games have a more open-ended structure, organized as a series of one-on-one short-term battles without a set track, just as much stretch of highway as it takes to win. The first game in the series, 1994's Shutoku Battle 94, was subtitled Drift King, in tribute to famed race car driver Kaiichi Tsuchiya, two-time winner of the 24 Hours of Le Mans, who is credited with popularizing drifting as a legitimate racing art form, and utilizing drifting in racing events that didn't even call for it. Early in his legitimate racing career, he was also heavily active in the illegal street racing scene, and his knowledge and expertise in that field has subsequently led to him being a consultant for all sorts of street racing media, including being the direct inspiration for the protagonist of the iconic manga and anime Initial D, and doing active stunt work for The Fast and the Furious, Tokyo Drift. The first two games in the series, Shutoku Battle 94, as well as its sequel, released in the Western world as Tokyo Highway Battle, both at least gestured towards traditional racing games. They were free-form, but still arranged in a multi-lap design. The third game, the Dreamcast exclusive launch title Tokyo Extreme Racer, did away with that framework and aimed for a more truly customizable, open-ended world. The other big alteration Extreme Racer makes is in its aesthetic. Shutoku Battle and Highway Battle have race times all throughout the day, from dawn to dusk. But Extreme Racer is set at a permanent midnight, an eternal blackness that gives it a moody, enveloping charge. Tokyo Extreme Racer starts you off in media res, literally already rolling down the road. But from here, every decision is yours. You drive the highways until you find prospective opponents, and the game puts the decision in your hands who, when, and where you want to battle. If you see a car you want to challenge, you flash your lights, and it's on. Both of you receiving a fighting game-esque power meter that depletes for whoever is in second place. There are a wealth of colorfully named racers and teams of varying skill levels that you can come across, and because the choices are yours, there's no system that builds from low to high. Sometimes you'll end up with the White Witch and get left eating dust, and sometimes you'll get Rolling Dude number 4 and be able to cruise to an easy victory. Technically, because you personally enact all race battles, you don't actually have to pick anybody and can just glide along on nighttime vibes for as long as you want. This game was one of the few Dreamcast games I actually played on initial release, and that sandboxy sense of being able to do as much or as little as you wanted was the absolute magic of the game for me. And when I discovered a sequel had come out on a system I actually owned, I snapped it up just as quickly. The loose procedural build felt so novel to me, and the tone was so cool and potent that I couldn't help but want to stay on the roads as long as I could. So I was shocked to find out that Tokyo Extreme Racer wasn't very well regarded critically, but the period reviews I read seemed nitpicky, bordering on malicious. Complaints about being too repetitious. It's a racing game. All racing games are repetitious, and this one has an almost RPG-style grind system. And having unrealistic physics. Its crash bounces are no more egregious than the critically untainted Gran Turismo series. I'm not sure if there was some sort of cultural pushback, or if this was just too unique for most 1999 gamers' expectations, but this middling general consensus confuses me. The closest I could see to a valid complaint is that the highway roads can feel a little too samey sometimes, and I wouldn't have been angry about some diversification of setting or visuals, but even then, battling different opponents is such an intense experience that I barely see the backgrounds at all when I'm in that zone. I found Tokyo Extreme Racer to be hypnotic and addicting and rad as hell in 1999. And I find Tokyo Extreme Racer hypnotic and addicting and rad as hell in 2022. Among my Dreamcast collection, it's a game I put on casually and come back to often, because I can play it a little or I can play it a lot. And no matter how much time I have, Tokyo Extreme Racer will always have something worthwhile to give me. Next time, y'all ready to have a chill time, compromising America's enemies to a permanent end? Flight combat games, like their quieter cousin, the flight sim, mostly exist in the realm of personal computers, where their nerdy specificity is mostly freed from the bounds of needing to structure a mainstream experience. An experience that got much spottier outside of the computer room. Remember computer rooms? The 90s, baby. In 1993, Namco released an arcade sim called Air Combat. Namco employees Masanori Kato and Kizumi Mizuno got assigned with bringing Air Combat to the brand new PlayStation console. But it became clear fairly quickly that the PSX would not be able to handle Namco's System 21 arcade hardware, and they decided to build a new game from scratch. It was released as a launch title for Sony's flagship system in September of 1995, under the same name in the US, but received a slightly altered title in Japan, Ace Combat. It was considered a visual disappointment, but a fun, addicting experience, and was a huge hit, especially in Japan. Working on a sequel, Kato was determined to improve on the first game's technical qualities. His team innovated a series of boundary-pushing graphical advances, as well as tweaking the structure to be less stringent flight sim, and more fun, stripped-down, casual arcade action. Ace Combat 2 dropped in the summer of 1997, and was an absolute sensation, selling huge numbers and getting consistent critical plaudits. Being considered not just a vast improvement over the first game, but a genuinely great game in its own right. Visually stunning, fast-paced excitement, with a high frame rate, a wide variety of planes and missions, and intelligent computer opponents. In 1998, Namco started work on the third Ace Combat game, to be subtitled Electrosphere, working this time to engage the player with a dramatic, involving storyline that would have an actual impact on the player's experience, and wouldn't just be window dressing for a basic shooty-shoots plane game. Meanwhile, at around the same time, about 15 miles southwest of Namco HQ, at Konami headquarters in Yokohama, they had a team working on a project whose stated goal, going by the results, must have been, hey, people like Ace Combat 2, right? There's not one of those coming out on this Dreamcast system we're building for, right? Cool, great news. I've got a wonderful idea. The result was Air Force Delta, known in Europe as Deadly Skies, which so blatantly copies absolutely every facet of its product from Ace Combat 2 that I'm almost surprised it wasn't legally actionable. Like, you'd expect the planes to look similar, since they're just gonna be planes, and HUD readouts are pretty standardized across all games involving flight, but like, we're doing mission briefings by showing colored arrows stretching across maps? See, but our arrows are blue, not yellow, and they're slightly thinner. It's not the same. Hell, this font even looks similar. This is some egregious thievery. That said, there isn't an Ace Combat game released on the Dreamcast console, and your only other opportunity to fly planes in any real context on the early days of the system was Arrow Wings, which I have shit on at length in this very series for being fussy and ruthless and overly critical and very unfun, without much in the way of convincing reasons to keep playing. Air Force Delta is fairly anonymous and sorta repetitive, but after Arrow Wings, it was hard not to find it a breath of fresh air. Air Force Delta isn't particularly dramatically compelling. They were copying so thoroughly off Ace Combat 2's homework that AFD has a similarly ludicrously convoluted fictional political storyline that matters not one iota, since every mission is just fly over there and shoot that motherfucker. But it has clear, direct goals and handles pretty reasonably, and that's enough to comfortably award it Funnest Airplane Dreamcast launch title. Flight combat sims are still not really my thing, but I can see why you'd play this and come back to it, especially without an ace combat on the system. The missions feel sorta repetitive and perfunctory, but it's easy to follow, and can be satisfying to complete and unlock new planes. My favorite part of this experience, amusingly enough, was the post-level replays, which showed you the cool shit you did in rad cinematic angles, allowing you to really focus on the sometimes bitchin' soundtrack, which has these moody hold musics that sometimes explode into wild industrial house synths. Pretty cool. All in all, Air Force Delta is a weirdly chill experience that I probably won't be revisiting, but it's fulfilling a need in its gaming community. And for the poor, neglected Dreamcast flight combat fans, that's more than enough. Next time, y'all ready to get shot up diagonally? The shooter genre, as a whole, has always had some debate about genre classification. Other than the pretty direct first-person shooter genre, there's a lot of muddled crossover among the rest of the definitions. Wikipedia includes a remarkable amount of games under the shoot-'em-up handle. But I was brought up that shoot-'em-up meant vertical scrolling shooter, a genre with the much more vivid synonym of bullet hell. But games like Robotron 2084 or Smash TV, where you're running around as enemies come from all margins, is this a shoot-'em-up? A run-and-gun? A free-roaming isometric shooter? My favorite definition is the driest, a multi-directional shooter. Like prototypical bullet hell games, the charm is in the chaos. With quick reflexes and unrestricted weapon spray, it can rise to a sort of trance-like purity. Multi-directional shooters are also known as dual or twin-stick shooters, thanks to arcade cabinets that provided movement along both axes. In the last few decades, dual-stick capability has become so standard to shooting games, so innate to the fundamentals of the style, that some classics of the genre from prior to Halo's debut on the Xbox in 2001 are now borderline unplayable, because we have literally rewired our brains to a more specific, customizable format. Rage Software's Expendable, originally released to PC as Millennium Soldier Expendable, is not a classic of the genre. But it is a pre-2001 shooter, and as such, it is designed for a twin-stick experience, yet provides only one. But Expendable could have still been a good, stupid time. There's nothing wrong with a bit of mindless, button-mashing violence, as games like beat-em-ups, another fun, open-ended genre, can be addicting fun, while only sometimes being defensibly good. Expendable is set in a post-apocalyptic future, where most of the galaxy was conquered by aliens, so some sort of cabal of scientists have cloned one or two super soldiers, and now you have to go and shoot anything that moves, as well as things that don't move, as nearly everything will explode if you pump enough rounds into it. But Expendable is set at a weird, elevated, near isometric angle. It makes the baffling, catastrophic, literally game-ruining decision to have nearly every opponent stand at a slightly diagonal angle from you, but not provide you any way whatsoever to specifically aim diagonally, nor any option to auto-aim at nearby opponents. So what should be heedless, charming nonsense turns into an agonizing struggle to hit villains literally inches from your face. Just shooting and shooting and missing and missing. So you try to flash spin around to take out some sort of perimeter, but that lack of dual stick movement means that you're still only hitting so many things. Even more insanely, there's a handful of bonus stages starting in level 3, presented in a totally normal, behind-the-back, third-person angle that works so much better, and would have led to a much more enjoyable time generally, one that they, for some reason, refuse to otherwise provide. Developer Rage was primarily a creator of soccer games, so why they decided to get into the shooter business, I do not know. But they needed some more playtesters maybe, or just somebody to be like, hey, this specific thing sucks, and I don't even know why you're doing it when you don't have to. I got a nostalgic charge out of Expendable's extremely late 90s PC CGI cutscenes, like something out of the Oddworld franchise. But the actual game was simple and repetitive and ruthlessly restrictive, and filled me with nothing much but unnecessary frustration. Befitting its title, there's pretty much no reason to ever play Expendable. Next time, a beloved fighting franchise hits its awkward teen years. Rarely does a single work fundamentally alter an entire genre. But fighting games can be entirely separated into two eras: before Street Fighter II and after. Prior to 1991, fighting games as a genre could almost exclusively be called karate games, with the only amendment being games trying to rip off Bloodsport, starring Jean-Claude Van Damme, specifically. Street Fighter II hit the video game world like a nuclear bomb, so fully formed that most of the things it popularized are still generally the way games in its genre work today, just refined to different aims. Shortly after its release, a small development team that had been trying to make several games based on Jean-Claude Van Damme movies that kept falling through, were able, thanks to Street Fighter II's success, to successfully pitch a fighting game with a Van Damme-esque character to Midway. But they set out to be different than Street Fighter in almost every way, with Mortal Kombat. Instead of colorful animated characters, they designed a game with large digitized sprites of real people, and set out to make it as wildly over-the-top violent as possible, with crunched bones, spurting blood, ripping limbs, and complicated finishing moves called fatalities, which featured graphic and gory cutscenes to finish matches. This garnered a lot of moral panic controversy, and was the primary game that inspired the Entertainment Software Rating Board. The team crafted a bigger and better sequel, which, thanks to controversy, was required to have green blood on some home ports, and was banned outright in Germany. Part of the reason some of these insane fatalities hit so hard was because of the vivid digitized sprites, where seeing a real, actual person get their spine ripped from their body felt more intense than just a simple cartoon character. By 1997, though, the series had become just a normal, familiar part of the landscape, putting out several versions of Mortal Kombat 3, and having inspired 2 PG-13 feature films. Capcom's senior director of communications even called it the Pepsi to Street Fighter's Coke. 1997 also saw the release of Mortal Kombat 4, which removed the digitized sprites of real people for an animated, three-dimensional world. 3D gaming was the new, fresh hotness at the time. But the technology was so new, now looking back, it feels like watching a talkie in the early days of sound filmmaking. Stiff, kinda ugly, utterly unrefined. The artistry of 16-bit gaming had truly been mastered, and now they were starting from scratch. 3D technology moved so quickly that between MK4's original release in 1997 and an expanded port called Mortal Kombat Gold for the Dreamcast in 1999, the 128-bit hardware, the most powerful to exist up to that point, provided the best-looking iteration of this series entry, and yet was also considered a bitter disappointment when compared to the visuals of, for instance, fellow Dreamcast launch title Soulcalibur. Gold promised every character from the original MK4, as well as the return of 6 classic characters that hadn't been seen in 3D before, including Katana, Melina, Cyrax, Sector, as well as Baraka and Kung Lao, the latter two being my mains as a kid for MK2 and MK3, and I had been bitterly disappointed when neither was present in the original release of MK4. But all the nostalgic additions in the world couldn't make up for its stiff, limited control scheme. Comparing it to the breathtaking fluidity of Soulcalibur, or the vibrant chaos of Power Stone, MK Gold absolutely felt like something from a less developed era. Gold also does try to modify the weak-ass weapon system from MK4, but somehow makes it even less useful, as it takes seemingly ages to ready it, in a forum where you need to be fast and efficient, something Soulcalibur implemented incredibly. Befitting that dated status, MK4 also wasn't literally 3D. The character models were, but the world was one-dimensional, with none of the free-range movement that Soulcalibur and Power Stone provided. After a half-decade run where audiences received the first 4 major MK releases, as well as 2 hit expanded ports, and a much-maligned single-player game, there would be no new prime MK fighting game from 1997 until 2002's Deadly Alliance. And in 1999, it just felt like nobody was clamoring for yet another port of MK4, expanded or otherwise. Jeff Gerstmann, writing for GameSpot, even said in his new release review of MK Gold that it, quote, felt like a retro game, like pulling out some old thing you haven't played in years, and it hasn't aged gracefully. Even worse, the original launch day release of Mortal Kombat Gold was packed with glitches and bugs, including the inability to save your progress in any way. They released a revised version about a month later with a red-tinted disc that said "Hot! New!" on the cover, trying to fix the issues. But by that point, it just didn't feel like anybody had any reason to be looking in on a years-old Mortal Kombat port in 1999. It had rid itself of its beloved aesthetic, while stepping into an arena it was ill-prepared for, with a shined-up but clunky, dated relic of past glories, especially in sharp contrast to the innovations being made elsewhere. MK4 always felt transitional, something of the runt of the franchise, and a slightly expanded version for a console capable of so much more. There just really isn't any reason to spend your time or money on Mortal Kombat gold. Next time, hop on your belly and slide along with the devil's favorite demons. What to say about Pen Pen Try Icelon? I knew we'd eventually get here, and now that day has finally arrived. And just to get it out of the way, that's Try Icelon. The English announcers pronounce it as Try Icelon, but either way, an absolutely insane portmanteau to just put on a box like you'll recognize it. Our penultimate of the Dreamcast's 19 American launch titles, and even more weirdly, one of the 4 original Japanese launch titles, is quite possibly its strangest, Blue Stinger notwithstanding. But here, it's almost entirely for aesthetic, stylistic reasons. The base concept, colorful cartoon animals competing in a triathlon, is a solid one. And with the full 4-player support that the Dreamcast provides, you can see how this could be a fun idea for a party game that could be more approachable for kids and adults alike. But once you turn the game on, you are immediately confronted with the demented, hideous designs of the characters, who are indefinable, but all feel like abominations that should not be. Adding to this experience is the revelation that they have been named using preschoolers' snap judgment naming conventions. One of the animals swims backward, so his name is Back. One of them is a shark, so his name is Jaw. This also extends to the course owners, which are a whole other can of worms that we'll get to in a minute. Pen Pen Try Icelon has sort of a clubhouse menu screen. Your options are race, dress up, results, or good night. Race and results are self-explanatory. Dress up allows you to customize your character with little hats and shit, which is fun. Good night is basically just a load save option, but in this delightfully strange screen that shows your character sleeping and tells you that you did a good job. Kinda love it. Anyway, you pick a character, and then you pick one of 4 tracks to race on, each of which has an easy, a medium, and a hard option. For some reason that literally does not factor into absolutely anything, each track has an owner. One track is sweets themed, so it's owned by Mrs. Cream, who smokes a cigar and mules cream, cream. Cream, cream, cream. The Toys track is owned by a man wearing what appears to be some sort of full-head rabbit or wolf mask, whose name is, for some reason, Bambi Mask. The Horror track is owned by Horror Man, who is literally just Jack from Power Stone, wearing a flame print duster and a top hat. Then we have the Jungle Course, which... oof. Inexplicably, there was a bit of censorship for this game's US localization, but that amounted entirely to removing smoking iconography from just the manual, not the game itself, while somehow allowing Unga Pogo here to make it through uncontested. His presence takes the game from ugly stupid to ugly offensive, and really casts a pall here otherwise. Of course, this would feel worse if the game was even the slightest bit playable or fun. The Try Icelon breaks down into sliding, swimming, and running events. Sliding and swimming are basically identical. Swimming just has an additional Y-axis, and rely on repetitious, timed button presses that are a perfect recipe for thumb strain after a short while. I found myself pining for the gold standard for 3D video game ice sliding levels, the Super Mario 64 level Slip Slidin' Away. which makes the much better decision to automate constant motion and rely on your skills to stay upright and procure coins. Somehow drastically, disastrously worse than the sliding and swimming segments are the miserable running levels, which feel like playing Fall Guys with the controls from Octodad. Scored to the squirrely floating camera from Blue Stinger. Every race I played was lost on the running levels, which are cumbersome and broken and near impossible to navigate. Everybody mostly goes the same speed in the other two, so running really is the killer here. Speaking of Blue Stinger, that game has an exceedingly random Easter egg where you have to collect 4 stamps to access a required next level, and all the stamps are Pen Triicelon characters, which lends credence that the Power Stone connection might be an homage and not a weird theft. But honestly, I wish they'd stolen a little more, because what I've described here is pretty much all there is to Pen Triicelon. There are only the 4 courses total, and although a couple, especially the horror one, are mildly charming, they run out of inspiration quickly, and you're left with a hideously ugly game that somehow plays even worse, and has at least one inexplicable decision that leaves it in the realm of genuinely disreputable. Next time, grab on to the Girth 2000, because we're getting hardcore. TNN Motorsports Hardcore Heat is wrestling with shadows. Reviews comparing games in the same genre to try and guide you as to where you should spend your hard-earned dollars is a time-honored tradition, as old as games and game reviews themselves. But I'm not sure I've ever before seen a situation where basically every single review of a given game is focused on how you should ignore it. Specifically because another game, one that won't be out for 3 full months, is on its way. The Shadow, in this case, belongs to Sega Rally Championship 2, which released into arcades in the spring of 1998, and became an instant sensation. And a year later, the hotly anticipated Japanese Dreamcast port was equally acclaimed. It was rumored to be one of 19 launch titles in the US, but rights issues and translation adjustments found it delayed until after Thanksgiving. So the door was open for an off-road racing game. In stepped CSK Research Institute, who already had one launch title with my nemesis, the maddening flight sim Aero Wings, and had dropped a middling off-road game into the summertime Japanese market called Buggy Heat, and had no problem gliding it over to the American market, now rebranded with a sponsor, and the cumbersome title TNN Motorsports Hardcore Heat. TNN itself was in something of a transitional period. For over 15 years, they had found great success as the Nashville Network, catering to a Southern American audience, heavily skewed towards country music with the Grand Ole Opry, and things like fishing, hunting, and rodeo. They also broadcast a wide variety of different types of racing through their TNN Motorsports block. Not only NASCAR and Formula One, but sprint cars, drag racing, and even monster trucks. So it made sense to extend their brand to the growing popularity of racing video games. And they did so in 1996, with an anonymous Jeep racing game called Hardcore 4x4. So when they aimed for another release, they bought up and rebranded Buggy Heat as Hardcore Heat to keep it in the stupidly 90s naming convention. But even as TNN was spending to license these games, they were quickly becoming a brand without a country. In 1998, they had officially gone the way of KFC, AT&T, and BP, and turned the Nashville network into simply TNN, which didn't stand for anything. By early 2000, they had decided that it did stand for something, the National Network, as they aimed for more mainstream programming. One of the prime victims of this was TNN Motorsports, which became defunct as TNN lost NASCAR to Fox and drag racing to ESPN, and replaced it with arena football and Extreme Championship Wrestling, the latter being a whole other dramatic can of worms that we'll discuss another day. So within a few short months of its release, TNN Motorsports Hardcore Heat became the only surviving thing stamped with that branding. And let me tell you, it is in no way ready to carry that burden. Like most of the contemporary reviews at the time, I want to lead off with the fact that the game does have a surprising amount of things going for it. The graphics are quite nice overall, the sound isn't bad, the courses are diverse and distinctive, set in a bunch of different individual terrains. The automobiles are also a varied bunch who all carry themselves uniquely. It even tries to do a very cute thing to build association and rooting interests for its racers by giving them full names and full-face CG renderings, as well as inexplicably detailed dossiers that break them down to blood type. Characters the game shows you on screen at all times, to try and build that sort of emotional investment. All the things I ask for in these sorts of games are present here, with one big exception. Hardcore Heat has an Achilles heel, and that's the fact that it handles like shit. Similar to the unyielding frustration of Monaco Grand Prix, Hardcore Heat attempts to thread the Drift King needle and ends up failing miserably. Like MGP, the game is ridiculously squirrely and splay-footed, and will go into what one reviewer called spin mode at the drop of a hat. And like MGP, it becomes demoralizing to even play.
Just gotta let off the gas sometimes. Just let it go, because everybody's kind of going the same. No, it did it again! You gotta be kidding me! Oh my god!
Hydro Thunder, the best racing launch title, is ruthlessly difficult as well, but the controls are responsive in a way that feels like even when you fail, you have room to grow. It motivates you to want to learn and improve. Hardcore Heat just feels broken, and all the nice visuals and imaginative courses in the world can't make up for a framework that just isn't fun to play. TNN, the Nashville network, the National Network, only lasted a few more years under those names before becoming rebranded as Spike TV in 2003, which has its own complicated connotations that you're likely familiar with, and I won't get into here. TNN Motorsports, however, closed up shop in early 2000, just a few short months after Hardcore Heat's release. But even by that point, thanks to that combination of bland, anonymous structure and deeply unsatisfying controls, I doubt many folks still had Hardcore Heat in their regular rotation, even by year's end. Next time, folks, Groundhog Day is over. The launch titles are all done. The sun has risen on September 10th. Also, they're here.